I knew it the second we pulled into the driveway, that familiar knot in my stomach tightening like clockwork. Family lunches at Daniel's parents' house were never just lunch. They were performances. And I was the understudy who didn't belong on stage. His mother always greeted me with that smile that never reached her eyes. And someone, always someone, managed to slip Natasha's name into the conversation like it was holy scripture. Classy, they'd say. So well-spoken. Such a perfect fit for Daniel. I had learned to let it slide, until today. Because today, Natasha walked in. She didn't knock, she didn't call, she just appeared. 1 minute, I was setting the table, and the next, she was there, hugged, kissed, and practically handed a glass of wine. And no one flinched. No one explained. Daniel's mother even pulled out a chair for her, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I stood there, frozen, napkin in hand, trying to smile while my heart slammed against my ribs. I glanced at Daniel, hoping for a sign of discomfort, but all I saw was ease, familiarity, the past being welcomed like royalty. And me? I became invisible. They laughed at her jokes, the same ones they used to roll their eyes at when I told them. She touched Daniel's arm once, twice, like it was nothing, and no one said a word. I couldn't believe what I was watching. I was in their home, with their son, and yet somehow I felt like the intruder. Like I was the one who needed to explain why I was there. My voice stayed quiet, but inside, I was on fire. Every look, every chuckle, every toast in her direction chipped away at something I couldn't get back. I kept telling myself to breathe. Just breathe. Smile when they smile. Nod politely. Don't let them see it's getting to you. But my hands were shaking beneath the tablecloth, and I could barely taste the food on my plate. Every story they told about Natasha was like a little performance. How she used to help decorate the tree, how she made the best lemon pie, how she fit right in. And Daniel? He laughed. He laughed. Like none of this was out of place. Like it was just a casual gathering and not a deeply twisted reunion. That was the part that hurt the most. Not Natasha's presence. Not really. It was his comfort in it. His ease with her sitting there, as if the woman he promised to love and protect wasn't sitting right across from him, slowly crumbling behind a forced smile. I searched his face for something. A flicker of discomfort. A glance that said, "I see you, I'm with you." But there was nothing. He was too busy reminiscing, too caught up in the nostalgia they served alongside the roast chicken. I was watching a version of my life unravel, and no one seemed to notice. I excused myself to the kitchen just to breathe. As I stood by the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, I could still hear the laughter from the dining room, so loud, so cruel in its indifference. I stared at the glass in my hand, half full, half empty, and I wondered how I had ended up here. When had I agreed to be tolerated instead of cherished? I had fought so hard to win their approval, played their games, bit my tongue. But today, I wasn't just excluded. I was erased. And something inside me, something tired, something old, started whispering that maybe I was done trying. When I returned to the table, Natasha was in my seat, my actual chair, the one I'd been sitting in before I stepped away. And no one thought that might be a little inappropriate. Not Daniel, not his parents, not even Natasha herself, who just smiled up at me and said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't think you were coming back." I didn't answer. I just walked around and sat at the far end, like a guest in someone else's life. From that distance, I watched my husband laugh a little louder and lean in a little closer to the version of me they preferred. Something inside me cracked. It wasn't rage. It wasn't jealousy. It was clarity, sharp and sudden, like sunlight through a dirty window. I realized in that moment that I could scream and cry and throw every plate in that room, and they'd still see me as the problem. I would always be too emotional, too dramatic, too much. They had already decided who belonged and who didn't. And Daniel? He had made his choice too, not with words, but with silence, with stillness, with the ease in his body when she was near and the discomfort when I was. So I stopped pretending. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I sat there, quiet, still. watching, studying, feeling every thread of resentment weave into something steadier, stronger. I was done begging for a place at a table that had been set without me in mind. But I knew this wasn't the moment to walk away. Not yet. Not while they were all still so comfortable. I stayed. I smiled. I let them enjoy their little performance. Because sometimes the best way to take back your power is to let them think they've won. The second we were alone in the hallway, I turned to him. My voice was low, steady, but it carried every ounce of betrayal I felt. "This is unacceptable," I told him. "She shouldn't be here. You need to leave with me, now." I wasn't asking for a scene. I was asking for solidarity, for the man I married to draw a line. But instead, he exhaled, annoyed, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "She's just an ex," he muttered. "You don't need to be so paranoid. Stop embarrassing yourself." Embarrassing myself? Really? I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from shame, but from sheer disbelief. His words didn't just dismiss me, they reduced me, made me feel small in the one moment I needed to feel seen. I looked over his shoulder and saw his family watching us from the dining room, eyes sharp, ears perked, waiting for the spectacle. I realized then they were hoping I'd snap, that I'd raise my voice, slam a door, confirm every cruel little label they'd pinned on me when no one was listening. But I wasn't about to give them that show. I stepped back and breathed, deep, calm, measured. I reached for my napkin, folded it gently, and placed it on the table like I was setting down the final piece of my patience. Then I turned to them, the whole table of smug smiles and false concern, and said, "Thank you all for showing me exactly where I stand." That was it. No drama, no sobs, just the truth, handed to them on a silver platter. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I walked out with my spine straight, my head high, and my heart breaking, but finally awake. The air outside felt different, sharper, colder, like it had been waiting for me to finally walk out. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't even fumble for my phone or look back at the house. I just kept walking, step after step, like each one was undoing a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The silence was comforting, like a blanket over a storm. But underneath it all, there was this steady pulse in my chest, not fear, not regret. It was something closer to liberation. Painful, yes, but honest, pure. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go back. Not to that table, not to that house, and not to a marriage that left me standing alone in front of people who clearly didn't want me there. I had spent years minimizing myself to keep the peace, biting my tongue, dressing the part, staying quiet when I should have spoken. And for what? For a man who couldn't even defend me when I was being humiliated in front of his entire family? No. That walk down the driveway wasn't just an exit. It was a reclamation of my voice, of my worth, of every part of me I had muted for him. The phone buzzed in my purse. I didn't even check. I already knew it was Daniel. Probably something half-hearted and dismissive, or worse, a demand for me to come back and act right. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Not after today. Something had shifted the moment I chose to walk instead of beg. The woman who left that house wasn't the same one who walked in. And even though I hadn't figured out what came next, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever I built from here, it would be mine. No more borrowed space. No more borrowed dignity. By the time I reached my car, my hands were trembling. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the weight of holding it all in. I sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, replaying every second of that lunch like a bad movie I finally walked out of. I thought about Daniel's face when I stood up. How blank it was. How he didn't even try to stop me. It stung, yes. But even deeper than the sting was a question I couldn't unhear. When did I start expecting so little from the man I loved? I drove for hours with no destination, just silence and a full tank of realization. Each mile that passed felt like shedding another layer of who I had been. The agreeable wife, the peacemaker, The woman who smiled through disrespect just to keep a place at someone else's table. I didn't want that table anymore. I wanted my own. One built from truth and peace and strength, not approval and scraps of affection. I didn't know exactly where to begin, but the first step was this: choosing me, even if no one clapped when I did. That night, I didn't answer his calls. I couldn't. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed the space to remember who I was before I became someone else's shadow. I sat in a cheap motel, lights dimmed, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My eyes looked different, not broken, not defeated, just awake. And as the phone buzzed again, lighting up the room with his name, I turned it face down. Because I was done performing. And the next move? It would be mine, not his. He called that night, and the next morning, and every hour after that. First, it was frustration. You're overreacting. Then came the softening. Please call me back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because what could I possibly say? That his silence had been louder than any insult? That watching him smile while I disappeared had cut deeper than betrayal? I wasn't ready to have that conversation. Not with him, and not with myself. So I let the phone ring, again and again, until his voice became just another noise I learned to tune out. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, but I welcomed it. I wandered through the space like a guest in my own life, touching the framed photos, the clothes still warm from the dryer, the shoes by the door I wouldn't be needing anymore. I packed slowly, methodically, as if each item held a memory I had to release before folding it into a box. My body moved on autopilot, but my mind was sharp, clear. It was like some part of me had stepped forward while the rest stood still. The version of Amanda who stayed, who tolerated, who dimmed her light, she wasn't the one making decisions anymore. By noon, the house no longer felt like mine. It looked the same, but the soul of it had shifted. There was no comfort left in those walls, no safety in the shared toothbrushes or the his and hers towels. I had loved him deeply, God had I loved him, but I wouldn't lose myself in the name of loyalty. Love shouldn't feel like shrinking. So I left a letter, just a few lines. Nothing dramatic, nothing cruel. Just the truth, sharp and final. Since your family misses Natasha so much, you can go back to her. I'm not competing for a seat at a table that was never mine. I walked out without slamming the door. No theatrics, just the soft click of finality. It was strange, really. How quiet heartbreak can be when you've already grieved for someone while they were still beside you. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't look back at the house. Instead, I drove with the windows down, letting the wind whip through my hair like it could scatter all the years I'd spent trying to be enough. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. What hurt more was realizing how long I'd stayed while knowing I was unwelcome. I didn't go to a friend's place or call someone to vent. I needed space, real space, where no one knew me as his wife or their disappointment. I checked into a short-term apartment downtown, something small but clean, with white walls and wide windows. It felt like a blank page. That first night, I slept with the windows open and a glass of wine on the floor beside my mattress. No TV, no phone calls, no explanations. Just me, exhausted, but finally safe in my own silence. And in that stillness, I made myself a promise. I would never again beg to belong. The next morning, I didn't hit snooze. I made coffee, strong, black, unhurried, and stared out the window as the city woke up below me. The world kept moving, indifferent and alive, and somehow that comforted me. It reminded me that life doesn't pause for heartbreak, but it does offer room for rebirth. I pulled out my old laptop, the one I hadn't touched in over a year, and opened a folder labeled Dreams. My freelance work. My forgotten self. I stared at it for a moment before clicking in. Not as a woman recovering from heartbreak, but as one finally returning to herself. I spent the whole day writing. Not for money, not for clients, but for me. Words poured out like they'd been waiting behind a dam. And now that I was alone, really alone, they finally had room to breathe. I wrote about the woman I used to be, the one who apologized for her feelings, who twisted herself into shapes to fit rooms that were never built for her. And as I typed, I started to see her clearly, not as a failure, but as someone who had survived 1,000 tiny cuts with her head still held high. Daniel kept calling. I stopped checking. Each voicemail was a mix of confusion and guilt. One minute he was defensive. "You're being dramatic." The next he was wounded. "Just talk to me, please." But I wasn't interested in talking. I was building something too sacred to interrupt. Every piece of clothing I hung in my new closet, every shelf I filled with my books and not his, every corner I claimed without compromise, it was all part of a quiet resurrection. And Daniel? He had become background noise, a distant hum I could choose to silence. But I knew this wasn't the end. Something told me he wouldn't let it go so easily. Not because he loved me, but because losing me forced him to face something he didn't want to see. I could feel it coming, like the shift in air before a storm. But I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I had rebuilt myself once, and I would do it again if I had to. This time, though, I wouldn't be fighting for a place in someone else's world. I was building my own, one quiet, deliberate, beautiful brick at a time. The calls didn't stop. If anything, they got more desperate. I didn't mean to choose them over you. I just didn't want to make it a bigger deal than it was. Please, Amanda. Please just talk to me. I listened to none of them, not out of spite, but because I had finally learned the difference between being missed and being valued. He missed the convenience, the quiet, the version of me who folded herself small so he could stand taller. But value? Real value? That would have looked like standing up for me when it counted, and he didn't. What he wanted now was redemption without reckoning, a do-over, without the discomfort. But I had spent years cushioning his comfort while mine slowly eroded. So no, I didn't return his calls. I didn't craft a dignified reply. I let him sit in the silence he used to weaponize against me. And in that silence, something magical happened. I started thriving. Not just surviving, thriving. Every morning felt like a new breath. I was lighter, sharper. I started to see myself not as someone recovering from a man, but as someone rediscovering her own gravity. I found a small apartment with big windows and no ghosts. The kind of space where I could paint the walls any color I wanted and leave dishes in the sink without judgment. I filled it with soft blankets, secondhand furniture, and plants that didn't ask for much, just sunlight and attention. Kind of like me, I guess. I said yes to dinners with old friends I hadn't seen in years. I said yes to early mornings and long walks and writing projects I once shelved because they didn't fit our life. This new life? It fit me just fine. I didn't need permission anymore. It was funny, the things I used to shrink for him. I stopped freelancing because it felt unstable, even though it made me feel alive. I stopped wearing red lipstick because his mother said it was too bold. I even stopped laughing too loud at family gatherings because he'd squeeze my hand under the table like a warning. And now? Now I wore red whenever I wanted. I laughed until my stomach hurt. I submitted pitches to magazines I once only dreamed of writing for. And with each tiny rebellion, I reclaimed a piece of myself they had taught me to hide. I thought maybe someone from his family would reach out, to apologize, to explain, something, but they didn't. Silence was their language too, the kind that dressed itself in politeness and empty traditions. I imagined them sitting around that same dining table, wondering how I could walk away from all they'd offered. Oh, but what they never realized was that it was never a seat at their table I wanted. It was respect. And the moment they served me pity instead of dignity, I lost my appetite. They didn't have to throw me out. They just made it clear I was never truly invited. And the best part? Natasha didn't want him either. That bit of poetic justice found its way to me through a mutual friend. Apparently she enjoyed the attention, the drama, the power of being the one that got away. But commitment? That was never on her menu. So now Daniel had no wife, no ex, and a very quiet house. And maybe, just maybe, The echo in those walls was starting to sound a lot like regret. But me? I had no time for echoes. I was too busy planting new roots in the kind of silence that felt like peace, not punishment. I started smiling without checking the room first. That's when I knew something had changed. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't curating my joy to make others comfortable. Every decision I made now came from a place of wholeness, not fear, not compromise. I filled my fridge with food I actually liked. I played music too loud while cooking barefoot. I sent in my first freelance invoice in months, and when the payment hit, I stood in my tiny kitchen and cried. Not because I was sad, because I was finally standing on ground I built myself. Daniel texted one night, "I miss your laugh." I stared at the message for a long time, not angry, not hurt, just indifferent. His words didn't carry the same weight anymore. I realized I didn't want to go back to the woman who used to wait for those crumbs of affection. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and now she was becoming someone new, someone softer in the right ways, sharper in the right places, someone who could build a life that didn't revolve around being chosen, because she had finally chosen herself. Still, I knew life had a funny way of circling back. People show up when you least expect them, especially when they can no longer control the story. I could feel it, like the air before rain. Something unfinished, something unresolved, quietly inching closer. But I wasn't bracing for it. I was ready. Whatever was coming next, it wouldn't find the same woman who once begged to be seen. No, it would find a woman who had stopped waiting for permission to exist, and who had learned to take up space, no matter who was at the table. The invitation came on thick cardstock, all gold trim and good intentions. A wedding, a cousin of Daniel's. Of course his family would be there, and of course they assumed I wouldn't show. But I RSVP'd yes, not to prove a point. That part of me was long gone. I said yes because I had every right to exist in any room, to occupy space without shame or explanation. And if the past happened to be seated at the same reception, then let it watch me glow. I wasn't coming back to fit in. I was coming back to rise. I took my time getting ready that day, not to impress, not to compete, but because I wanted to. The red dress fit like a second skin, bold, unapologetic, beautiful. I curled my hair the way I like it, not the way he used to suggest. I wore the perfume I had stopped using because his mother once said it was too strong. And beside me stood someone new, a man who didn't need me to shrink. He didn't hold my hand to control me. He held it because he wanted to be near. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who finally looked like herself again. We walked into the venue and the air shifted. Heads turned, eyes widened. There was a pause, brief, but telling, as if the entire room needed a moment to recalibrate what they were seeing. I didn't flinch. I didn't falter. I smiled, greeted the hosts, and walked right past the people who once made me feel invisible. Daniel was there, of course, sitting with his parents. Their eyes locked on me like I was a ghost who'd come back to haunt them. Only I wasn't haunting. I was glowing, alive, and they couldn't look away. Daniel stood up when he saw me, like reflex, like his body remembered something his heart had already let go of. I met his eyes for just a second, long enough to see the weight behind them. Regret, maybe, or just the ache of realizing what he used to have now belonged to someone else. But I didn't linger. I wasn't there for closure. I had already written my own. I turned slightly, smiled, and leaned into the man beside me, the one whose presence didn't shrink me. Daniel sat back down slowly, like he'd just seen the ending of a story he didn't write. His family looked like they were trying to decide how to react. His mother, ever composed, gave me a tight smile that barely touched her face. His father avoided my gaze entirely, and Natasha? Nowhere in sight. That absence said more than words ever could. For a moment, they all looked like actors on a stage who had forgotten their lines. And me? I was no longer part of their scene. I had become the audience, watching it all with calm detachment. There was no bitterness in my chest, just a strange, satisfying peace. I wasn't seeking their approval anymore. I had brought my own seat, and it fit just fine. As the music picked up and guests began to dance, I felt completely untethered. Free in a way I had never known inside that family's orbit. I wasn't checking for whispers or watching for eye rolls. I wasn't bracing for cold shoulders or coded insults. I was just there, dancing, laughing, living. At one point, I caught Daniel watching me from across the room, not with anger, not even longing, just realization. And when I passed by him on the way to the bar, I stopped just long enough to say it, soft but certain. Tell your family I finally found someone who's not afraid to stand beside me, no matter who's at the table. He didn't respond, just stood there, stunned, as if the words had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't need it. I turned and walked back to the dance floor where my date was waiting, hand outstretched, smile easy. And when he pulled me close, I felt it, not just affection, but equality. No masks, no roles, no invisible rules to follow, just two people, side by side, moving in rhythm without fear of judgment. That moment didn't need a spotlight. It glowed all on its own. The music faded into something slower, warmer, and I let my head rest against his shoulder. I thought about everything I'd walked through to get here, the insults disguised as compliments, the silent betrayals, the rooms I entered where I had to earn every inch of space. And now, standing in this one, I felt none of that. No tension in my chest, no need to shrink, just breath, ease, presence. I wasn't someone's wife or disappointment or comparison anymore. I was Amanda, fully, loudly, freely. And for the first time in years, I felt like the love I was giving out was finally circling back to me. As we spun across the floor, I caught one last glimpse of Daniel, still watching, still alone. And maybe that was the real punishment. Not my anger, not my absence, but the realization that I was never the one starving. They were. They served me disrespect, and I had left them with empty plates and quiet forks. And now, I was dancing. Not for revenge, not for show, but because I was free. Because I had built a life that didn't require their permission. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply never looking back.